Now, the rest of the story. Jane Doss had never won anything in her life. She had done her share of losing. Jane was the widow Doss. I do not believe that she was pitied, although folks might see her at a distance and say, there goes the widow woman. We must visit her sometime, but few ever did. And as I say, Jane had never won anything in her life. But this was the spring of 1825, and Jane's luck was about to change. In 1732, Britain's King George II granted the territory to a general named James Oglethorpe. The territory we're talking about in the state of Georgia. The following year, Oglethorpe founded a settlement on the Savannah River. He defeated the threatening Spanish in 1742. That was called the Battle of Bloody Marsh. It was not until 1754 that Georgia actually became a royal province. In 1776, the delegates to the Continental Congress supported national independence. Georgia's statehood was granted January 2, 1788, and she was fourth of the 13 original states to ratify the United States Constitution. Now, those are the basics of early Georgia history. And yet some historians contend that Georgia history begins with the Land Act of 1803, for it was then that the state government first sought to tame the wild woods of Georgia by getting as much land as possible into the hands of private citizens who then would develop it. This would be accomplished by lottery. In fact, 8 land lotteries were planned within a period of less than 3 decades. One of those lotteries took place in 1825, and that brings us to the widow Doss, who had never won anything in her life. Now, Jane lived in the Knox district of Jackson County. She had no interest in DeKalb County. And yet the land she acquired in the lottery of 1825 was in DeKalb, spelled DeKalb, specifically in the 14th district, even more specifically, lot number 78. Well, surely Jane was not all that enthusiastic about her acquisition. Lot 78, as virtually all the lots in the district, were solid woodland. Were she a man, perhaps she would possess the urge as well as the physical strength to strike out and clear the land by hand. Indeed, there was a certain irony in the fact that the only women eligible to participate in the land lottery were widows. But Jane Doss hung on to Lot 78 for 1 year. For in 1826, she discovered a buyer, one Matthew Henry of Gwinnett County, and Jane sold Lot 78 to Matthew for 25 cents an acre. Not once had Jane even visited her property. The philosopher says everything is a matter of perspective. That's why we today, regarding that distant yesterday, stand dumbstruck and disbelieving. You see, the widow Jane Doss had no use for lot number 78 in the 14th district of DeKalb County, Georgia. No use at all. So she sold that land for 25 cents an acre. 2.5 acres in all. What I'm saying is that the widow Jane Doss sold outright that which would become the entire north half of downtown Atlanta for $50. And now you know the rest of the story.
And now the rest of the story. Lot 78 was one of the best land deals in American history, although it only included 202.5 acres. Other great land deals included the 1803 Louisiana Purchase, in which the United States paid France $15 million for 828,000 square miles of land west of the Mississippi River. And let's not forget the purchase of Manhattan Island for the value of just 60 guilders. 25 cents an acre for woodland in 1826 was a wonderful deal. Adjusted for inflation, 25 cents in 1826 would be about $7.75 an acre in today's money. I'd buy all the timberland I could at $7.75 an acre. In that year, 1826, Matthew Henry bought the 202.5 acres for $50. Now, $50 in 1826 would be just under $3,100 in today's money. Henry kept the property for a dozen years before he sold Lot 78 to Judge Reuben Cohn for $300 or $1.49 per acre, which adjusted for inflation is just under $10,000 or $49 an acre. Wow. In 1836, 2 years before Judge Cohn bought Lot 78, the Georgia General Assembly voted to build the Western and Atlantic Railroad to link Savannah, a city on the Atlantic Ocean, to the Midwest, more specifically Chattanooga, Tennessee. An engineer, some sources claim he was American Army Civil Engineer Stephen Harriman Long, he was chosen by the Georgia General Assembly to recommend the location where the railroad would terminate. He surveyed several possible routes and drove a spike into the ground at his chosen spot. The spot where he drove the spike is located near the corner of Forsyth and Magnolia Streets in Atlanta. The settlement known as Terminus, which literally means end of the line, developed in what was Lot 78. In 1843, Terminus was incorporated as the city of Marthasville, and 2 years later, Georgia's General Assembly passed an act which changed the name of the settlement to Atlanta. Judge Cohn purportedly divided up the land and sold it at low prices to encourage more people to settle in Atlanta. Cohn Street in downtown Atlanta was named in honor of Judge Reuben Cohn. Had it not been for the railroad, the area known as Atlanta might still be timberland. During the Civil War, the railroad became somewhat famous in what is called the Great Locomotive Chase. At about 4 o'clock in the morning of April 12, 1862, the crew of the locomotive called General left Atlanta en route for Chattanooga. The one-way trip totaled 138 miles. At Big Shanty, now called Kennesaw, about 28 miles north of Atlanta, the crew stopped the General in front of the Lacey Hotel and went into the dining room for breakfast. 23 passengers, James J. Andrews and his 22 Union Raiders, all of which were wearing disguises, remained on the train. While the crew was eating breakfast, the Raiders detached all but 3 freight cars from the General. His men jumped into the freight cars. Andrews, along with his engineer and conductor, boarded the locomotive and left Big Shanty at full speed. Captain William Allen Fuller and the rest of the crew were completely shocked, but Captain Fuller immediately suspected that the Union men had taken the train. Captain Fuller set out after the train in a dead run, followed by Mr. Kane and Mr. Murphy. Captain Fuller outran his 2 companions, arrived at Moon's Station 2 miles north of Big Shanty, secured a hand car with the help of 2 track hands, traveled backward to pick up Mr. Kane and Mr. Murphy, and then the 5 men raced north after the General. Rather than trying to catch up to the General, Mr. Murphy wanted to get to Etowah in time to catch the old engine Yonah. After clearing numerous obstructions from the track, which were attempts by Andrews to thwart anyone who may be chasing them, the exhausted men finally reached Etowah, 7 miles north of Big Shanty, and commandeered the Yonah. They attached an empty coal car to Yonah. A few Confederate soldiers boarded the coal car, and the Yonah chased after the General toward Kingston. The Union Raiders had placed obstructions on the track to prevent an engine from following them with any speed. Despite this, the Yonah made the 13-mile run to Kingston in just 14 minutes. At Kingston, engineers had to move the heavy freight trains around in the rail yard because of the actions of the Union Raiders. Captain Fuller and the other pursuers ran north through the rail yard and commandeered another train called the Rome. But while at Kingston, the Union Raiders had loaded a car with cross ties. As they headed north on the General, they shoved cross ties out of the back of the train onto the track. Captain Fuller rode on the cow catcher on the Rome and removed the obstructions. The cow catcher is at the front of the train, painted red here on the General. 6 miles north of Kingston, Captain Fuller and the other pursuers had to abandon the Rome because the Union soldiers had removed several rails. Captain Fuller and Mr. Murphy ran towards Adairsville, 4 miles to the north. Just south of there, they flagged down the southbound train pulled by the engine, Texas. Captain Fuller and Mr. Murphy explained their predicament, and the chase resumed. At Adairsville, they unhooked the cars and continued the chase with the Texas and its tender traveling at full speed in reverse. Captain Fuller rode on the back of the tender. The 10 miles from Adairsville to Calhoun was completed in just 12 minutes. At Calhoun, the Texas stopped and picked up the telegraph operator who was trying to repair the line cut by the Union raiders. Aboard the Texas, the telegraph operator wrote a dispatch to General Ledbetter at Chattanooga, telling him of the capture of the train and asking him to make sure that they did not pass Chattanooga. 2 miles north of Calhoun, on a long straight stretch, the pursuers came in sight of the raiders for the first time. The raiders had stopped to remove a rail, but when the Texas appeared, they detached a car and went ahead at full speed. Captain Fuller and his pursuers had no choice but to attach the abandoned car to their train and continue the chase. Now remember, they're traveling backwards. Captain Fuller rode on the boxcar so he could signal if there were more obstacles on the track. The Union raiders detached another car and pushed it from the train towards the Texas to slow their chase. As before, Captain Fuller's men attached it to the train and continued. At Resaca, 5 miles north of Calhoun, Captain Fuller's men detached the 2 cars on a sidetrack and continued the chase. The chase between Resaca and Dalton was said to be the fastest in the entire affair, and every person who took part in it feels a thrill when calling it to mind. At Dalton, 15 miles north of Resaca, they let the telegraph operator off so he could transmit the dispatch. The telegrapher had just finished sending the dispatch over the telegraph when the Union raiders cut the telegraph wire. The Union raiders were attempting to remove a rail when the Texas came into view again. The raiders returned to the General and headed north under full power. Both trains were traveling with the steam valve fully open. Men on both trains were pale when they rounded each sharp curve. Despite this, they never slowed the trains. 2 miles north of Ringgold, the Union raiders slowed the General, jumped from the train, and disappeared into the woods on each side of the track. Captain Fuller and 2 others chased after the raiders while some of the pursuers recaptured the General. The remaining men on the Texas returned to Ringgold to get the militia. That afternoon, 4 of the raiders were captured. Andrews and 7 other raiders were executed by hanging. The remaining raiders eventually escaped to the north and were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, the first time the Congressional Medal of Honor was given out. To many Northerners, James J. Andrews and the other Union raiders are the heroes of the Great Locomotive Chase. Andrews and the other 7 Union raiders who were hanged as spies are buried in the Chattanooga National Cemetery. Near their graves is a memorial to the Andrews raiders topped with the model of the General. To many Southerners, Captain William Allen Fuller was the hero of the Great Locomotive Chase just because of his sheer determination and ultimate success in retrieving the stolen locomotive. He is buried in Oakland Cemetery in Atlanta, Georgia. In 1950, the state of Georgia commissioned a special gold medal in honor of Captain Fuller's work during the Great Locomotive Chase. It was presented to his son, William Alfred Fuller, on May 15, 1950. The General, the locomotive at the center of the Great Locomotive Chase, was the real hero. The General is currently housed in the Southern Museum of Civil War and Locomotive History in downtown Kennesaw, Georgia, the town from which the General was stolen, and is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. I created a map which shows the locations of the Great Locomotive Chase. I'll leave a link to it in the description. I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching. And now you know the rest of the story.